The Boleyn story is one of the most gripping tales in English history, a saga of love, ambition, betrayal, and tragedy that still fascinates us 5 centuries later. Everyone knows the name Anne Boleyn, the queen who changed the course of a nation and lost her head on the scaffold. She has been portrayed as a temptress, a victim, a reformer, and a villain, her rise and fall retold in countless books and dramas. But behind Anne's dazzling figure, hidden in the shadows, was another Boleyn whose story is just as dramatic, and in some ways even more revealing. His name was George Boleyn. To many, he is remembered only as Anne's brother, dragged down by her fall and condemned on the same false charges that sealed her fate. Yet George was far more than a tragic side note. He was a man of talent and ambition, a poet, a diplomat, and a skilled courtier whose brilliance earned him a place at the very heart of Henry VIII's court. He supported his sister's rise, played a role in the king's great matter, and became a trusted envoy abroad. And when the tides turned against the Boleyns, he was accused of the unthinkable, not because he was guilty, but because his enemies knew that by destroying him they could destroy, and as well. What if the true story of George Boleyn has been lost beneath the weight of scandal? What if behind the sensational accusations lies the story of a courageous man whose loyalty and intelligence shaped history, even as it led him to the scaffold? Tonight, we are stepping into the shadows to uncover the life and legacy of George Boleyn, the unseen figure whose story changes everything we think we know about the Boleyns. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we are exploring George Boleyn's rise, his role in Anne's story, the shocking charges that destroyed him, and why his legacy deserves to be remembered on its own. And Boleyn has long stood at the center of one of the most dramatic and tragic stories in English history. Her name is etched into the popular imagination as the queen who captivated Henry VIII, altered the course of the kingdom by helping to bring about the break with Rome, and met her end under the blade of an executioner's sword. She is remembered as alluring, clever, ambitious, and controversial, a figure whose rise from the daughter of a courtier to Queen of England seemed improbable, and whose fall was as swift as it was brutal. Countless books, plays, and films have told her story, sometimes casting her as a schemer, sometimes as a victim, and always as a woman who could not be ignored. Yet in focusing so closely on Anne, another figure has often been left in the shadows, a man whose fate was bound to hers in ways both personal and political. That figure was her brother, George Boleyn. His story is rarely given the same attention, but without understanding him, the picture of Anne's life, her rise, and her downfall remains incomplete. George Boleyn, unlike his sister, did not capture the fascination of later generations to the same extent. He left no direct descendants, his poetry and writings have largely vanished, and his life is often described only in relation to Anne's. To most, he is remembered only as one of the men accused of treason and adultery with the Queen, charges that were meant to blacken Anne's name and secure her destruction. His death, like hers, came on the scaffold in May of 1536. But George was not a mere supporting character in Anne's tragedy. He was a central figure at court in his own right, a man of wit, charm, and ambition who navigated the dangerous currents of Henry VIII's reign. His position as the unseen figure is not because he lacked importance, but because his role has too often been overlooked or deliberately overshadowed by the larger-than-life presence of his sister. To re-examine George is to uncover another layer of the Boleyn story, one that reveals the full extent of the family's power, their burdens, and their downfall. The Boleyn family's ascent was rapid and remarkable. They were not born into the highest ranks of nobility, but rose through a mix of service, alliances, and opportunity. Thomas Boleyn, George and Anne's father, was a skilled diplomat and courtier who advanced under both Henry VII and his son Henry VIII. Through his marriage to Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, he linked his family to one of the greatest noble houses in the realm. From these foundations, the Boleyns built their fortune and their influence, their children standing as symbols of the family's ambitions. By the time Anne and George came of age, they were expected to shine at court, to embody both the refinement and the cunning needed to survive in an environment defined by competition, flattery, and constant change. The pressures on the siblings were immense. The Tudor court was a stage where favor could vanish overnight, where rival families plotted constantly, and where the king's moods determined the rise and fall of entire houses. For the Boleyns, the rewards were dazzling, but the risks were equally great, and became the focus of Henry VIII's obsessive pursuit, a relationship that brought her family to the very center of power. George, too, gained recognition as a talented courtier, and was entrusted with diplomatic missions abroad. His wit and intelligence were praised, and he became known for his poetry, his eloquence, and his presence in justs and court entertainments. Together, the Boleyn siblings represented the family's brightest hopes. Yet what made them valuable also made them vulnerable. Their visibility at court, their closeness to the king, and their influence over him bred jealousy and resentment in others, laying the groundwork for the storm that would later consume them. George's role in Anne's story went beyond that of a brother merely cheering from the sidelines. The two shared a deep bond, strengthened by their upbringing and by the unique pressures they faced together, and relied on George not only as family but as an ally, someone who could understand the precariousness of their situation and support her in the turbulent world of the Tudor court. George often acted as a confidant, and his closeness to and may have contributed to the perception among their enemies that their relationship was too close, a suspicion that would later be twisted into accusations of incest. While those charges were almost certainly false, their very invention reflects how deeply George and Anne were linked in the eyes of their contemporaries. George's downfall was not collateral damage. It was part of the strategy to destroy and in targeting him, her enemies. What makes George's story especially striking is how it mirrors Anne's, not only in its tragic ending, but in the way it illuminates the dangers of proximity to power. Both siblings thrived in the court's glittering world, both drew envy and hatred, and both ultimately fell victim to the ruthless calculations of politics. To speak of Anne's rise without George is to miss the shared journey they undertook, the partnership that made their family's position so formidable, and the connection that, in the end, sealed both their fates. The unseen figure of George Boleyn, often dismissed as a footnote, deserves to be recognized as a central character in the drama, one whose life and death shaped the story as much as Anne's did. The tale of the Boleyns is not only about ambition, desire, and betrayal, but also about the bonds of family. Anne's legacy is well known, but to see it fully, one must look also to George, the brother who rose with her, stood beside her, and fell with her. In his story lies a revelation beyond the familiar narrative, a reminder that history's spotlight often hides as much as it reveals. To recover George from the shadows is to gain a new understanding of and of the Boleyns, and of the forces that defined one of the most dramatic chapters in English history. George Boleyn's story is too often eclipsed by the shadow of his sister, but when we step back and look more closely, his own life comes into focus as one of privilege, promise, and personal talent. His early years were shaped by the Boleyn family's rapid rise, and unlike many courtiers whose positions were owed almost entirely to birth, George's intelligence and charm ensured that he stood out in his own right. His upbringing was one that gave him every advantage, and from the very beginning, his education and exposure to courtly culture made him an impressive figure. Where Anne's name has become inseparable from the drama of Henry VIII's court, George's own brilliance often remains unacknowledged, though it was evident from the earliest stages of his life. Born into a household that was already securing its place among England's elite, George was raised in an environment where learning, refinement, and diplomacy were valued. His father, Thomas Boleyn, was a man of great skill in languages and foreign negotiation, and it is no surprise that his son inherited these strengths. George's education was not simply a matter of learning the basic expectations of a gentleman, but was steeped in the classical tradition. He mastered Latin, which was the foundation of learning and communication across Europe, and also gained fluency in French, the essential language of diplomacy, culture, and poetry. His knowledge did not stop there, as he also displayed an aptitude for writing verses of his own, although much of his poetry has sadly been lost. What remains clear, however, is that George Boleyn was not only well-schooled but also gifted, capable of using his talents in a way that won him admiration in intellectual circles as well as at court. The Boleyn household, through Elizabeth Howard's lineage, connected George to one of the most powerful noble families of the kingdom, the Howard clan, whose influence was extensive. This dual heritage of ambitious service and noble blood provided George with opportunities that few young men of his generation could match. From an early age, he was expected to uphold the family's growing prestige, and he did so not reluctantly, but with the enthusiasm of someone who thrived in the world of learning, competition, and courtly display. The refinement of his manners and the sharpness of his intellect made him stand out, even before Anne's relationship with Henry VIII catapulted the Boleyns to their greatest prominence. George's introduction to court life came as part of the natural progression of a young man of his rank, but it was his personal merit that made him notable. He secured positions not merely because of his family's connections, but also because he impressed others with his wit, eloquence, and ability to navigate the subtleties of court etiquette. He was, in every sense, a Renaissance man, with interests that stretched beyond the political into the cultural. He enjoyed justs and tournaments, where he showcased the martial skill expected of a nobleman, but he also engaged deeply with literature and intellectual discourse. His command of languages made him an asset in diplomatic missions, and he was sent abroad at various points, representing not only his family's interests but also the king's. In these roles, George demonstrated that he was more than simply Anne Boleyn's brother. He was a figure who could hold his own in the sophisticated courts of Europe, carrying the reputation of England and of the Boleyn family with dignity. The records that survive give us glimpses of a man who was both admired and envied. He had the grace and charisma that made him popular in social settings, drawing people toward him not only because of his family's prominence, but also because of his natural ability to charm. His social life at court was filled with the entertainments and spectacles that defined the Tudor world: masques, banquets, hunting, and poetry readings. George thrived in these settings, earning a reputation as someone who could both compete in the physical trials of justs and excel in the refined challenges of wit and rhetoric. It was this versatility that made him so valuable to the king and so dangerous to his enemies, for a man who could shine in many arenas was a man others would want to see undone. His talents as a linguist and poet were not minor footnotes, but important aspects of his persona. Poetry in the Tudor court was not just an artistic pursuit, but also a means of political expression, a way of displaying refinement, and at times, a tool for veiled commentary. George's verses, though few have survived, were said to have been sophisticated and elegant, displaying both his education and his creativity. He belonged to a generation of courtiers who saw language as power, where a well-turned phrase could win favor as effectively as a victory on the tournament field. In this way, George's intellectual prowess placed him firmly within the cultural currents of his time, a young man deeply engaged with the ideals of the Renaissance. Yet beyond these talents, George was also a man of energy and enjoyment, someone who relished the social whirl of courtly life. He had a reputation for charm and a certain boldness, qualities that, while they served him well in gaining attention, may also have fueled the resentment of rivals. Accounts of him suggest that he was both admired for his brilliance and criticized for arrogance, a balance that many ambitious young men at court had to maintain carefully. In George's case, his charisma often tipped the scale in his favor, ensuring that he remained a favored presence at court even as the combination of his talents, his education, and his charm made George Boleyn a formidable presence in his own right, someone whose story should not be confined merely to his association with Anne. His early life shows us a young man who embodied the ideals of his age, a figure of both intellectual and social promise. By exploring his talents and his achievements, we begin to see him not as a shadow cast by his sister, but as a bright light who illuminated the court with his own brilliance. His trajectory was always intertwined with Anne's, but it was built upon foundations that were uniquely his own. George Boleyn's promise as a young man of talent and charm quickly transformed into responsibility and action as the drama of Henry VIII's reign began to unfold in earnest. The king's pursuit of an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, which later became known as the King's Great Matter, drew the entire court into a battle that blended personal passion, political maneuvering, and spiritual upheaval. And Boleyn stood at the very center of this conflict, but she did not stand alone. Her brother George played a vital role, often quietly but no less crucially, acting as both her ally and a shrewd figure in his own right. To understand the unfolding of the annulment, the king's eventual break with Rome, and Anne's ascent to queenship, one must look at George not merely as her brother, but as one of the architects who helped shape the course of events. By the early part of the 1520s, George was already known as a promising courtier. His wit, his knowledge of languages, and his familiarity with diplomatic practice made him particularly valuable to Henry VIII. At a time when international alliances were shifting and the king's desires were becoming increasingly complicated, George stood as a figure who could help translate those desires into action. The annulment was not simply a matter of the king's personal wishes, but one that entangled the prestige of England, the authority of the papacy, and the political dominance of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and Catherine's nephew. Into this dangerous web stepped George, whose missions abroad and counsel at home made him far more than a supporting player in the king's cause. One of George's most significant contributions came in his work as a diplomat. Sent to courts abroad, he acted as the king's representative in delicate matters, often dealing with French envoys and ambassadors. His fluency in French gave him an advantage, for in these exchanges, language was not merely a tool of communication, but also of persuasion and subtle influence. George's presence in such discussions reveals that Henry trusted him with responsibilities that could shape the broader European response to his request for annulment. The annulment was not simply a legal case to be argued in Rome, but a matter of international opinion, and George's skill in fostering England's position among foreign powers gave the king a stronger voice. Within England, George's role was equally important, and needed allies who could support her not only in personal terms, but also in the political sense. Her rise depended on more than Henry's affection. It required the careful navigation of court factions, the steady reinforcement of her legitimacy as a queen-in-waiting, and the undermining of Catherine's long-standing position. George was indispensable here. He served as an intermediary between Anne and other figures at court, smoothing over conflicts, strengthening alliances, and ensuring that Anne's cause did not falter in the face of opposition. In this way, George became not only a brotherly companion but a political partner, deeply engaged in the careful construction of Anne's ascent. His involvement in the annulment proceedings extended to the intellectual and religious debates that swirled around the issue. The annulment touched upon questions of scripture, theology, and the authority of the Pope, and George was no stranger to such discussions. Educated in the classics and skilled in argument, he supported the scholars and clerics who advanced Henry's case, lending his voice to the movement that would eventually fracture England's relationship with Rome. His own sympathy toward reformist ideas gave him a perspective that aligned well with Anne's, for she too encouraged Henry to embrace a more independent religious stance. In this way, George's influence reached beyond politics and diplomacy, seeping into the very foundations of the English Reformation. There were moments where George's role can be seen clearly in the record. His presence in diplomatic correspondence, his handling of messages between Anne and Henry, and his participation in conversations with leading figures of the day reveal him as an active force. He was not a passive observer, but someone whose words and actions carried weight. For example, when ambassadors from France needed reassurance of England's intentions, it was often George who delivered the message with the grace and authority expected of a high-ranking courtier. In such acts, he not only served the king but also reinforced Anne's position as the future queen, making it clear that the Boleyn family was united, competent, and indispensable. As Anne's influence over Henry deepened, so too did George's. His proximity to both the king and his sister made him a conduit of power. This closeness, however, also painted a target on his back. Rival factions at court, particularly those loyal to Catherine of Aragon and her allies, began to see George not merely as a courtier, but as a dangerous opponent whose talents made him difficult to dislodge. His ability to charm, his skill in debate, and his role in shaping Henry's decisions made him central to the success of Anne's cause, and therefore central to the threat she posed to the established order. In examining the unfolding of the king's great matter, it becomes clear that George's contribution went beyond the surface duties of a courtier. He was a strategist who understood the stakes of the annulment, and who used his gifts to bolster his sister's position at every turn. The annulment was a prolonged struggle that dragged on for years, tested alliances, and forced Henry to reshape the very structure of the English Church. That such a massive transformation occurred was due not only to Henry's determination and Anne's persistence, but also to the steady support of figures like George, who carried out the work that ensured those desires. George's actions during this period reveal him as indispensable, not because he stood in the spotlight, but because he worked so effectively behind the scenes. He embodied the role of the skilled courtier who advanced not only his family's fortunes, but also the king's ambitions, using diplomacy, intellect, and political acumen to strengthen their position. His hand can be seen in the threads of the annulment story, woven tightly into the fabric of Anne's rise and the English Reformation. At the height of his influence, George Boleyn appeared to embody everything his family had worked for. He was trusted by the king, he was admired at court, and he shared in the aura of triumph that surrounded and as she was crowned queen. Yet power in Henry VIII's England was as fragile as it was dazzling. The very qualities that had made the Boleyns indispensable also made them vulnerable. Success bred jealousy, Influence provoked fear, and the king's affection was never permanent. From the moment Anne placed the crown on her head, the seeds of suspicion and resentment had already begun to take root, and George, as her closest ally and most visible supporter, was drawn inexorably into the dangers that would undo them both. What began as a story of brilliance and ascendancy shifted into one of paranoia, betrayal, and calculated destruction. The court of Henry VIII was never a stable place, but by the mid-1530s it had become a pressure chamber. And, once the dazzling object of Henry's desire, began to face criticism from factions who longed for her replacement or who still remained loyal to Catherine of Aragon. The king himself, restless and unpredictable, grew frustrated as Anne failed to provide the male heir he desired. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting who represented both a new object of the king's affection and an opportunity for Anne's enemies to advance their cause. With the queen's position slipping, the Boleyn family's fortunes, tied so tightly to hers, began to falter. George, once celebrated as the eloquent courtier and trusted envoy, now became a marked man, not because of any crime he had committed, but because he represented the very power structure that hostile factions sought to dismantle. The shift from influence to danger was subtle at first. Whispers circulated that the Boleyns had grown too proud, too arrogant in their dominance at court. Rivals, resentful of their rapid rise, began to weave stories that cast them as dangerous manipulators who held too much sway over the king. The combination of envy and opportunity created fertile ground for slander. Anne's sharp tongue and bold presence often alienated those around her, and George's own confidence and brilliance made him an easy target for resentment. In such an atmosphere, it required only a spark to ignite the accusations that would bring about their downfall. That spark came in the form of fabricated charges, the most scandalous of which accused George of committing incest with his sister. The very idea was shocking and designed to horrify, but it is crucial to recognize how flimsy the evidence was. No credible witness testified to such a crime, and the circumstances described by their accusers were implausible. The charge was not born of fact but of calculation. By attaching George to, and in the most intimate and grotesque way, their enemies ensured that her destruction would carry with it the complete ruin of her family. It was a weapon not of truth but of propaganda, meant to blacken Anne's name and to eliminate George as one of her strongest defenders. The accusations did not end with incest. George, along with several other men of the court, was charged with adultery with the queen and with conspiring against the king. Each charge was a thread in a web carefully spun to entrap the Boleyns. The trials that followed were not about justice but about spectacle. The outcome had been decided long before George ever stood before his accusers. He was not given the chance to mount a true defense, nor were the inconsistencies in the evidence taken seriously. Witnesses were unreliable, testimonies were contradictory, and yet the machinery of condemnation moved forward with ruthless efficiency. To those who orchestrated the downfall, facts mattered far less than the appearance of guilt. To understand why George was targeted, one must look at the broader motivations of those who engineered these events. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, who had once allied with the Boleyns but had turned against them. Cromwell had his own agenda, one that required removing, and in order to secure his vision for the kingdom. Her reformist leanings clashed with his political strategies, and her influence over Henry threatened his control of royal policy. To rid himself of her, Cromwell needed to ensure that her entire circle of support was eliminated, and George stood at the very heart of that circle. If Anne had any chance of defending herself, it was through her brother, the man who had stood by her as confidant, advocate, and partner in ambition. To destroy Anne, Cromwell had to destroy George as well. George's trial was, in many ways, even more symbolic than Anne's. While her guilt or innocence was debated in the context of her marriage and her ability to produce heirs, George's charges struck at the heart of the family's dignity and honor. The accusation of incest was meant to strip away not only his reputation, but also the moral foundation of the Boleyn name. It turned the siblings' closeness, which had once been a strength, into a weapon used against them. The fact that there was no credible basis for such claims mattered little. What mattered was that the accusation was sensational enough to justify the queen's downfall in the eyes of a king who had grown weary of her, and in the eyes of a court eager to move on to Jane Seymour. The political motivations behind George's destruction are clear. He became a scapegoat, a sacrifice offered up so that Henry could rid himself of a wife he no longer wanted, Cromwell could consolidate his authority, and the factions loyal to Jane Seymour could rise in prominence. In this sense, George's death was not an accident of circumstance, but a calculated necessity for those who stood to gain from the Boleyns' fall. He was a convenient victim, not because he had done anything wrong, but because his position made him essential to remove. His brilliance, his eloquence, his closeness to Anne, these very qualities sealed his fate, making him too dangerous to leave alive once the tide turned against his family. When George mounted the scaffold in May of 1536, he did so with a composure that revealed both his courage and the injustice of his fate. He spoke eloquently, refusing to admit to crimes he had not committed, but also refusing to challenge openly the judgment of the king. His words reflected the impossible position in which he had been placed, condemned by false charges, powerless to defend himself, and yet still determined to face death with dignity. In that moment, George was no longer the charming courtier or the witty poet. He was a tragic figure, sacrificed not because of what he had done, but because of what he represented. The downfall of George Boleyn is one of the most striking examples of how power at Henry's court could be both intoxicating and fatal. His life had been one of brilliance, talent, and service, yet his death was the result of lies and political maneuvering. To understand his end is to understand the ruthless logic of Tudor politics, where ambition could lift a family to greatness and jealousy could tear it down. George's story is not merely a footnote to Anne's tragedy, but a central part of it, revealing how deeply their lives were intertwined and how thoroughly their enemies worked to erase them both. George Boleyn's final days left behind a complex legacy, one that has too often been clouded by the sensationalism of the charges that destroyed him. The image most frequently repeated in histories and popular retellings is that of the accused brother, bound to and by scandal and rumor, a man whose name became inseparable from the charge of incest. Yet when we look past the false accusations and examine the way George conducted himself during his trial and execution, a different picture emerges. His composure, eloquence, and courage in the face of certain death reveal a man of integrity who, even in his downfall, managed to preserve his dignity. In this sense, George's legacy cannot be reduced to the sordid stories fabricated by his enemies. Instead, it deserves to be reconsidered as the testament of a courtier who, though destroyed by politics, left behind an example of honor and steadfastness. At his trial, George was forced to listen as charges of adultery and incest were laid out against him, accusations designed not only to condemn, but to humiliate. The proceedings were little more than theater, with the verdict predetermined and the evidence flimsy at best. Yet even within this carefully staged performance, George managed to assert himself. His defense was eloquent, and although he could not hope to sway the outcome, he used his words to maintain some measure of truth in a sea of lies. He denied the charges without descending into bitterness, a choice that reflects both his intelligence and his understanding of the futility of open defiance in the face of royal will. In doing so, he preserved what dignity was left to him, ensuring that his legacy would include not only the shadow of scandal, but also the memory of his courage. His execution on Tower Hill in May of 1536 has often been remembered alongside Anne's more famous death, but George's final moments deserve attention in their own right. He spoke with composure, acknowledging his fate without despair. Like others condemned under Henry's justice, he avoided openly criticizing the king, but his words carried a sense of restraint and solemnity that marked him as a man unwilling to allow lies to define him entirely. For those who witnessed his death, George's conduct was a reminder that even in the face of destruction, there could be grace. The sensational charges could not completely erase the impression left by his final appearance, where he revealed himself to be more than the caricature painted by his enemies. He became, in those last hours, a tragic figure who refused to surrender his humanity. The impact of George's downfall on the Boleyn family was profound. The family that had risen so quickly, dazzling the court with its influence and ambition, was shattered almost overnight. With both Anne and George executed, their father Thomas Boleyn found his fortunes ruined, his ambitions destroyed, and his name tarnished. The Howard connection that had once strengthened the Boleyns could not shield them from disgrace. The sudden and brutal removal of George and Anne not only ended their personal stories, but also served as a warning to every ambitious family at court. Proximity to power was as deadly as it was rewarding. In this way, George's death was not simply the end of one man's life, but part of a broader cautionary tale that echoed throughout the Tudor court. Beyond the personal devastation, the downfall of George and reshaped the political and religious landscape of England. Their removal cleared the way for Jane Seymour to become queen, a change that altered the dynamics of the court and gave rise to new alliances. It also strengthened the hand of Thomas Cromwell, who used their destruction to secure his position and further his reforms. Yet the very brutality with which Anne and George were removed foreshadowed Cromwell's own eventual fall, reminding all that the Tudor court was a place where no position was secure. In this sense, George's death was part of a larger cycle of rise and fall that defined Henry's reign, a cycle in which ambition and destruction were inseparably linked. The English Reformation itself was shaped in part by the events that led to George's end. He had been a supporter of reformist ideas, and his intellectual sympathies aligned with those who questioned the authority of Rome. His death, along with Anne's, temporarily weakened the reformist cause at court, allowing more conservative forces to regroup. Yet the break with Rome, already set in motion, could not be undone. George's role in the years leading up to the annulment and Anne's queenship had helped pave the way for the religious transformation of the kingdom, and though his life was cut short, his influence lingered in the changes that followed. His absence was felt not only by his family, but also by the movement he had quietly supported, a reminder of how deeply his personal story was intertwined with the fate of the nation. When considering George Boleyn's legacy, it is tempting to see him only through the lens of victimhood. He was, without question, a casualty of political maneuvering, sacrificed to satisfy Henry's desire for freedom from, and Cromwell's need to remove obstacles to his own power. But to leave George in that role alone is to do him a disservice. He was not merely a passive figure caught in events beyond his control. He had been an active participant in the most significant political struggles of his age, a skilled diplomat, a poet, a courtier whose talents were recognized across Europe, and a loyal supporter of his sister. His life was not defined solely by his end, but also by the many contributions he made in his years of service. To see him only as a victim is to forget the vibrancy of his earlier achievements and the significance of his role in shaping the course of Henry's reign. It is also worth reflecting on how history has remembered George. The scandal of the charges, particularly the accusation of incest, has overshadowed his real accomplishments. Popular narratives, drawn more to the sensational than the subtle, have often reduced him to little more than a supporting player in Anne's tragedy. Yet modern reassessments invite us to look again, to peel away the layers of rumor and propaganda, and to see George as he truly was. When we do so, we find not a man defined by scandal, but one defined by talent, loyalty, and courage. His fate was tragic, but his life was meaningful, and he deserves to be remembered as a figure of importance in his own right. The story of George Boleyn, then, is not merely an appendix to Anne's. It is part of the fabric of Tudor history, woven into the rise and fall of a dynasty and the transformation of a kingdom. His downfall reveals the dangers of ambition in a world ruled by a capricious king, but his legacy also reveals the resilience of human dignity in the face of injustice. By reconsidering George not just as the victim of false charges, but as a man of significance, we restore to him a place in history that is both fairer and truer. His life and death altered the trajectory of his family, shaped the course of the English Reformation, and left behind a story that speaks not only of tragedy, but also of enduring strength. To remember George Boleyn in this light is to move beyond the sensational and the scandalous, to see the man who once stood at the heart of one of the most dramatic chapters in English history. He was more than Anne's brother, more than a victim of Cromwell's schemes, more than the accused of an infamous trial. He was a courtier of talent, a diplomat of skill, a supporter of reform, and a man whose composure in the face of death reminds us that dignity can endure even when justice does not. His story, though tragic, is not one of defeat but one of significance, a life cut short but never meaningless. In giving George his due place in the narrative, we gain not only a fuller picture of the Boleyn family, but also a deeper understanding of the turbulent world they inhabited.